Hi and welcome to this special webinar event with Simon Pressley. This is a webinar that I pre-recorded and am sharing with you today. We had some technical issues in the platform that it was designed to go in, and we moved over to Zoom, so you may hear me referencing that a little bit throughout the interview. But nevertheless, we got a great interview with Simon. He talked to us about some of the best performing property markets in the 5 years prior to COVID, what actually happened with COVID and why he was so convinced that the property market would boom when all of the chief economists for the banks were in a consensus that we're talking about 30% drops. And as an educator, rather than throw out the hotspots that he thinks are going to outperform in 2025, he does share some of that, but also the knowledge that drives those decisions when he's picking those areas out on the map, and how we can learn what actually influence property markets and help ourselves to get that success in what we're trying to do with property, rather than listening to media commentators, so-called experts, or following the herd. It's an awesome interview with Simon and webinar here, and I'm pleased to present it to you today. Cheers. Today, the subject that we've got is Australia's wildest 5 years in properties, boom, bust, and what's next with Simon Pressley. And if you haven't come across Simon before, we're just letting Grant into the room. Welcome, Grant, if you can hear me. I had these slides actually from the last presentation you did with us 2 years ago, Simon, and it didn't say anything about the Brisbane Lions. So I chucked that in as the first point, because I think that is probably the most important thing for anyone to know about you, is that you're a mad Brisbane Lions fan and you've had a good couple of years, let's be honest. Outside of that, you're a buyer's agent, market analyst, accredited advisor, REIQ Hall of Famer. You're, of course, the founder and head of research at Propertyology. And I think the person to go to when I'm sort of thinking about what's happening in the property market, what's likely to happen in the future, and what metrics would have which impact on the property market. You've been doing that for a long, long time, and I think your forecasts and your results speak for themselves. So just as we're getting the last couple of people into the room, a bit of an insight into what we're going to cover. We're going to look at what happened, not just in 2004, but in the last couple of years, and what we can actually learn from it. The townships and cities that were the best performances. We're going to compare certain markets around the country over time and get some insights into what's happening and what Simon's been looking at. And of course, everyone's going to want to know, well, which hotspot do I buy in 2025 so that I can just be achieving all of my financial goals. And then, of course, we're going to do a Q&A at the end as well. So what I will do is I will take the slides off the screen and I'll hand over to you, Simon, to begin with. Now, you can definitely prompt me on the slides that you want to share there as well. But I thought a good thing to talk about was lemon suckers as a starting point. Now, this is a phrase that you coined a number of years ago, and believe it or not, it's perennially useful, because it seems like there are lemon suckers in the media every single week. There's no shortage of stories where people are, in your view, sucking lemons rather than taking a little bit more of an optimistic view of property. So let's talk about that and the last couple of years.
Well, lemon suckers was literally the first few months of COVID, and we're talking about the 5 years of from when COVID started up till now. So the reason I coined that phrase, Mike, was right at the very, very start, when the international border closed, people will hopefully remember that every single person on the planet was saying, we're about to see the biggest property market crash in Australian history. And I couldn't have disagreed more strongly, and went out and said, and looked down the barrel of TV cameras and said, the opposite's going to happen. The value of your home is going to be safe. In fact, very, very soon, you're about to experience one of the biggest property booms you've ever seen. And of course, people didn't want to believe that. So I sort of thought, well, they don't believe it because everyone else is saying doom and gloom. So I coined the phrase lemon suckers to remind people that it's not just now as in being the start of 2020. I asked them to reflect on what these so-called experts say every single year going back as far as digital records are kept, and look how accurate they are. That they always look through the glass half empty, and are never have ever been remotely close with their forecasting. And the last 5 years, it's just proven that some things in life just never change, mate.
I remember talking to you about that when you had that conversation with your close team before communicating to the public. And I love hearing that story, because you couldn't have been more certain in a very, very uncertain time globally, much less what's going to happen in property. And there were some nerves in your inner sanctum about, gosh, Simon, like, we believe in you, we love you, we know how clever you are, but what if you're wrong?
Yeah, but look, honestly, I have never been more certain. I'm a heck of a lot less certain now about forecasting what might happen in different markets over the next few years than what I was when COVID hit. And why I say that with as much conviction as I possibly can is when you're forecasting, you are anticipating the actions of a lot of different people. You know, property markets performance is a reflection of decisions made by lots of key people: federal governments, state governments, local governments, industry sectors around the world, existing businesses, new businesses, credit policy, interest rates, all those things, right? And with the exception perhaps of the start of COVID, there's a lot of politics and what's popular and all that sort of stuff. So it's hard enough to get inside someone's head at the best of times. But when you do that, you're sort of trying to think, well, what should they do and what's the right decision? But what might be the right decision won't necessarily be popular for someone. So they might actually do something that's not necessarily right. When you've got 8 billion people in one planet that have all got one thing in common, hey, can we just stay alive? Suddenly, all of a sudden, what is unpopular and politicking goes out the door. So that's why I've never been clearer and more confident about what's going to happen with property markets back then than right now. Before we step through some key metrics of the last 5 years and what property market did what and why, I just want to reflect on, I'm going to do a dot point summary of the major events that happened over the last 5 years. So we're talking the period at the very beginning of 2020 to the end of 2024. So we started the 5-year period. People will probably remember this. It felt like all of Australia was literally on fire. There were bushfires everywhere. And then within a couple of months, we had flash floods in large parts of Australia, especially in southeast Queensland, North Queensland, and different parts of New South Wales. But by January, there were reports every single day of tens of thousands of people dying in different parts of Europe. In February 2020, ScoMo told us all, please no longer shake hands, tap elbows. And we thought, oh my God, what the hell is about to happen here? At the end of February 2020, that's when all the forecasts start. Every single economist in this country and every bank in this country said that Australian house prices, no matter where you live, were going to decline by no less than 10% and by as much as 50%, according to some of them. And we responded to that and said, no, we called it safe as houses, and we coined the phrase, beat the seagulls to the chip, because there's about to be a really, really big boom, and those who get there early will get the most of it. The border actually closed on the 20th of March, 2020, international border. And then the doomsday forecasting accelerated. Oh, no, you can't have property price growth without population growth. The only one who says that has never heard me talk before. That's never been the case. And we're about to see that it's certainly definitely wasn't the case for the last 5 years. And population growth will never, ever be remotely close to the biggest force on property markets. Hopefully people will learn that from COVID. We were all forced into national lockdown for the first time the 29th of March. So with the exception of some doctors, nurses, police officers, you all had to go and work from home, and we had no idea what was happening. There was the rental eviction moratoriums. That then led to the next big doomsday forecast, which said we're going to have all these empty homes across Australia. We're going to have landlords en masse selling up. We're going to have rent prices crashing. 2 months later, we published a report and said that large parts of Australia, you're going to see rents increase by as much as $100 per week or $5,000 per year. Again, we were told that we had no idea what we were talking about. Zoom at the start of COVID in April 2020 was only available for 2 out of 195 countries. But by May in the year 2020, all 195 countries had access to Zoom, and there were 200 million users per day on Zoom. So one thing that we can tell our grandchildren in years to come about what happened in that crazy 5-year period of time, that was one. We then had, and this next bit will become very important to property market performance. I'll apologise in advance because this might make some people feel uncomfortable, but it's what happened. So we had the federal government and we created the National Cabinet, if you can remember that. And what they decided to do was they said, well, there's no wars. We're all fighting the one war called the germ. Let's make the Australian Army available to help those in quarantine. So 7 out of 8 states and territories accepted the federal government's offer and used the Defence Force to police quarantining. One state bucked the trend. Within a month, that one state had 800 people die, and that city went on to break global history for the most number of days in lockdown and caused an enormous adverse impact on that entire state's economy, which has flown through to a very poorly performed property market since then. It's no coincidence. The unemployment rate peaked at 7.5%, far from the global recession, the big depression that was forecast. Some people were saying we'll see 30% unemployment rates. It peaked at 7.5%.
I remember 30. I remember them saying 30, and I just kind of thought, geez, there's going to be blood in the streets if there's 30.
And while I want to summarise what happened, yes, primarily we're going to be talking here about property market performance, but it's helpful to reflect on what was actually said and how humans always default to fear. But very, very, very rarely in life does the fear that we get worried about actually materialize. I've already given some examples of fear of property prices, fear of rent prices, fear of empty houses. The absolute opposite happened. Fear of 30% unemployment rate, not even close. Not saying that some bad things didn't happen. By the end of 2020, our capital cities were ghost towns. But what we also saw, I certainly didn't expect to see this, was suburban cafes right throughout Australia were thriving, record turnover. People always love our coffee. We might not be getting in the CBD, but we're still enjoying our coffee. Businesses that sold suits and dresses closed their doors. Some of them never to reopen. Leisure wear went through the roof. But by the start of 2021, the highest demand perhaps in the existence of caravans, boats and CUVs, it just went nuts. That's what everyone wanted. So there was some sporting first. The NRL and the AFL grand finals for the first time ever were played in Brisbane in the year 2020. In the year 2021, there was no rental accommodation available anywhere. There was not a location, capital city or region anywhere in Australia that the vacancy rate was not below 1%. It's rare for any city to have a vacancy rate below 1% for 1 year. We had the whole country below 1%. But let's keep in mind, the international border was closed. We can't keep blaming those overseas migrants for every time something happens and we don't like them. They weren't to blame. Sydney and Melbourne in the year 2021 is one of those fun facts. In the calendar year 2021, Sydney and Melbourne combined, their population declined by 120,000 people. Now that's equivalent to a city the size of Bendigo and Ballarat, which are our 20th largest cities in a country of 400 different townships. So that happened in one calendar year. In that same calendar year, the year 2021, 5 of our 8 capital cities saw their median house price increase by 30% or more.
Wow. One
of those 5 was Sydney with a declining population. Now, it's rare for any city to have a double-digit, 10% increase in their median house price in 1 year. We had 5 out of 8 capital cities have 30% or more in that 1 year. And again, population was declining. Regions had even higher growth. I'm not saying all, but a lot of them had even higher. In 2022, in February 2022 is when the international border opened, initially gradually. But we also had in the same month, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that became, I guess, the impetus for the inflation word that we've heard a lot of in the last couple of years. A lot of commodities, valuable commodities, come out of that big country called Ukraine, but it was locked up. In March 2022, once we started to hear about inflation, the brain then immediately went to, whoa, those interest rate rises are probably going to start happening a bit earlier than forecast. We probably remember that the then RBA governor month after month said, yeah, interest rates, our next movement will be up, but we're probably not going to increase until about 2024. They wanted to see wages increase significantly before they touched interest rates. But their hand was forced because of global inflation. But in March 2022, because of inflation, the same lemon suckers that forecast every other doomsday, oh, there's another reason to come up with a different forecast. And the word mortgage cliff started to roll off the same lemon suckers' tongues every single day. And it's only recently stopped. We ended 2023, $1.6 trillion in consumers' cash, offset accounts, advance payments on mortgages, $1.6 trillion, and the home loan arrears rate was still below 1%. At the end of 2023, why is that relevant? Because the cash rate from May 2022 to the last increase in November 2023 went from 0.1% to 4.35%. The single sharpest increase in the RBA cash rate in the history of the RBA, which dates back to about 1960. So we've got a 5-year period where we've been locked up, where our population's declined, and we've had the largest spike in home loan interest rates, but yet it's now forever etched in history. That 5-year period is one of the best, strongest periods for economic growth, for first home buyer activity, for job creation, for retirement nest eggs, and for the value of real estate. This is a historic period.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. And I know you're a student of history and, of course, the history of property in Australia, but you've really got to go back to sort of some of the intervention around the end of World War II, where there were caps and those sorts of things to see anything that stands out on that macro map like COVID did, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, let's hope we never see it again, but because of the health part of it. But the best progress in life, in the history of humans, Mike, happens through challenges and adversity, because it forces us to think laterally. And some of us are natural solution seekers, but unfortunately for most people, they need to be pushed into a corner before they actually exert the energy to find a way out of it. And COVID did that for people. We were more than pushed into a corner, weren't we? We were locked up into our homes, so we were forced to think laterally. And for some people, certainly not all, but for some people, their lives have forever changed in a good way because they were forced to change. If we think about the number of people who today are living in a completely different city now to where they were living in 5 years' time. And we think of, we've still got roughly 4 out of every 10 Australians who are in the workforce are now working from home. Some of them, including me, work from home every moment, every day, and some adopt the hybrid variety, but very, very thankful for it, but never would have done it if we weren't forced into the corner to think about change. So a lot of good things have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to bring up one of the great slides that you've given us as well, Simon, which is the golden era in property for Australia. So I wanted to ask the question as well around property performance during that period. Obviously, you talked about the number of capital cities that we saw, those 30% growth periods, but the majority of the big changes or the big growth was the regions rather than the capital cities. Of course, you talked about people exiting the cities because of the lockdown and those sorts of things, and no need to go back into the office. But was there more of a reason as to why regional Australia outperformed the cities?
No, it happens every single year. It just never gets reported unless people like you and I have conversations to remind people that it happens every single year. We've only got 8 capital cities. That is what it is. You and I and no one else can influence that. We've got 8 states and territories. So there are only 8 capital cities, whether it's in the year 2025 or whether it was in the year 1955. We've got 8, but we've got 400 individual regional townships. So it's just basic mathematics. Every single year, not just during the 5 years we're talking about today, every single year, bar none, the very best performed property markets are always among the 400 and not among the 8. But that doesn't mean that none of the 8 do well or they all do poorly. And it certainly doesn't mean that all of the regions do well. But it's just basic mathematical odds that every single year the best will be among the 400. There are some locations during this 5-year period that benefited significantly from people relocating to that location, but we can say the same about, the capital cities. I think, with the exception of Melbourne and Victoria broadly, everyone benefited in different ways. We still had 3 capital cities. You can throw a blanket over their property market performance. Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth, their median house price over this 5-year period of time increased by about 75%. Now, a reference point for everyone listening, a solid year for any 5-year period of time would be if the median house price increased by about 30%. I would describe that as a solid year, referencing, what's happened over decades and decades and decades. That would be a solid year. So 75% growth in 5 years it has happened before, and believe it or not, we've had periods when it's been much, much more than that. But certainly 75% in a 5-year period of time is not normal. It's exceptional, really. But we also had 29 individual townships, none of which were capitals, where their house prices doubled in that 5-year period of time. So whilst there are about 400 individual townships in this huge country, Mike, our report focused on the ones that have a population size of 15,000 people or more.
Right.
So give an example, Port Hedland is one of the 29 locations that the median house price doubled, and it has a population of about 16,000, 17,000 people. Byron Bay has a population of about 35,000 people. So 15,000 is, by no means a dot on a map, but there are 29 individual townships where the median house price doubled in just 5 years. In total, there are 118 out of 140 townships that have that population of 15,000 people or more. So almost all of them saw 70% or more increase in its median house price in that 5-year period. Phenomenal.
Mm. And I suppose many of them were beneficiaries of interstate migration, but certainly not international migration during the majority of that period with the lockdowns, right?
That's true. Interstate migration, yes, but I guess we're talking about existing Australians moving across a border somewhere. Among those 29 locations where the median house price doubled, they were all in one of 4 states. So Queensland had the biggest contribution. It was about 15 out of 29 townships, from memory, where the median house price doubled. Western Australia and South Australia also had strong representation. New South Wales had 2. The Snowy Monaro municipality, which is sort of Mount Kosciuszko region, Cooma and Jindabyne, for those who are familiar with that beautiful part of the world, and Broken Hill was the only other one in New South Wales. Tasmania's best performed property markets, Burnie and Launceston, had about 70%, which is strong. Victoria had a couple of really good performers, but they were nowhere near Melbourne. So Mildura, Wodonga, Wangaratta, Shepparton, they all had about 70% growth. Again, phenomenal. The absolute wooden spoon in all of Australia was Alice Springs. Out of those 140 townships, they have a population of 15,000 people or more. So Alice Springs median house price increased by 9%. Locked in second last place was the second biggest city in Australia, Melbourne, with 20%. What's interesting about, lots of things are interesting about Melbourne, and unfortunately Melbourne will be in the doldrums for quite some time yet. Melbourne, whilst it had 20% growth in a 5-year period of time, that's far from horrible. I mentioned earlier, 30% in 5 years is solid. So 20% is far from horrible. But when you've got 118 individual townships that had 70% or more, that's the reference point, right? There's a big gap.
Exactly.
Now, one of the 5 years we're talking about, the year 2021, when everywhere in Australia went absolutely nuts, and population declined in that year, Melbourne's median house price increased by 25% in that 1 year. Across the 5 years, it increased by 20%.
Yeah,
Quite,
I mean That's pretty incredible, isn't it? And you can see on the slides you were talking about Alice Springs and the worst capital at only 20% growth on that particular slide, and then also, I mean, you've put some great material here together that shows the unprecedented rise in interest rates. Obviously, in the previous one, you can see the population change for those lockdown periods. And then we all know the story about rental supply. And, property taxes is another, probably a topic for another show, right?
It's interesting though. Let's have a quick look at property taxes. I can't stand politics, as Mike knows as well as anybody, but we don't need to like them. But more than any other human, they have the single biggest influence on what happens with property markets, good or bad. Their policies have the single biggest influence. So if you have a look at the bottom right-hand corner there, the 10 columns there represent the combined total amount of taxes collected by federal, state and city council for the last 10 years, with a dotted line in the middle separating the 5 years directly before COVID from the 5 years after the international border being closed. So what do we hear every single day from every politician, whether they're Liberal, Labor or bloody Greens? Every single day they're telling us what they're doing because they care about housing. They have actually only added 15,000 extra homes to this country in 5 years. 15,000, that's it. They have produced a whole heap of new policies that have discouraged people from adding extra properties to the rental pool, because it's private individuals that add properties to the rental pool, not governments. But They've done one thing, and they're absolute masters of it. They've taxed the bejesus out of 27 million people. Just have a look at those columns. So whenever they say anything about what they care about, never, ever, ever believe anything they say about anything they care about in terms of housing. They care about one thing. They have collected $380 billion in the last 5 years from property taxes alone. $380 billion. We've got some premiers saying we can't afford $3 billion to build a brand new stadium to host a global event called the Olympics that they put their hand up to host.
Puts it in context, doesn't it? And aren't we at the point where the stamp duty revenue alone is touching around about $1 billion a week?
Stamp duty, the latest figures available is about $40 billion. That was in the 2023 financial year. So if by the time they release the data, it's sort of they're a year old. But for this current financial year, don't be surprised if between our 8 states and territories they're going to collect $50 billion just from clipping tickets known as stamp duty.
It's incredible, isn't it? And it seems like we're at the point where they're drunk on that revenue. Like, I know you don't want to talk about politics, but we've talked a little bit about Melbourne. You've shared the insights about being the only state that didn't get the federal help from the military to enforce that lockdown. It broke the international record of the most lockdown city in the world, I believe. And now we've got this budget repair levy / land tax that they're saying maybe will be unwound in 10 years. But can you imagine themselves weaning themselves off that drug in 10 years' time?
No, I can't. I mean, the sad, and I love Victoria's, even though I don't live there. I love Victoria as much as any state, and I visit beautiful Melbourne frequently. But we can want what we want and we can hope for what we want to hope for. But, some things in life, whilst they're challenging, like there's no quick fix. And the sad thing for the whole state of Victoria, we're not just talking about Melbourne's property market, is they have got an enormous state government debt, most of which has been accumulated from lots of reckless financial decisions over the last 5 years. And now and always, Mike, the single biggest influence on property market performance is local economic performance, not the national economy. It's the economy of Melbourne or the economy of Brisbane or whichever individual township we're talking about. And there are some people that have more influence on economic performance than others. But it's very, very hard to have a positive influence on an economy if you don't have financial resources to do that. So, the infrastructure pipeline in Melbourne that was very impressive sort of 6, 7, 8 years ago, and no coincidence that Melbourne's economy was really impressive back then as well. that infrastructure pipeline now is nearly empty. You know, when the projects that are currently under construction are finished, there's not much left. There's been a lot of infrastructure projects that have been scrapped because they've got no money. They put their hand up to host the Commonwealth Games, and then 18 months later, they reneged on that because they got no money. There's been 80,000 people who used to live in Melbourne that packed up their cars and have relocated to different parts of Australia. There's been lots of businesses that have closed. And sadly, for the CBD of Melbourne, there's an enormous number of offices that are still largely empty. So this is why the property market of Melbourne, not just the last 5 years, but again, sadly, it's not what people want to hear, but it's what you need to hear. The outlook for the Melbourne property market will continue to be miserable because nothing can improve until the inputs and the actions improve. So the measures available at the disposal of particularly the state government to improve the local economy there is very, very limited. So how do you fix that? You know, well, ask yourself the same question. If it was your personal balance sheet, a household balance sheet, and you're drowning in debt and you've got a big interest bill, and your expenses are exceeding your income, what levers can you pull? You can go and earn some more income, right, to try to cover that interest bill, but not often easy as done as what it said, right? Just earn some more income. If you're a government, what does income mean? Tax. Got to charge more. Got to charge more tax, which have done that, right? But what's that done? Lots of big businesses with money have gone, hey, this is an unfriendly environment for us to invest money in. We'll go and invest that money and build a factory or a retail shop or whatever somewhere else where it's a more tax-friendly environment. So, yeah, what other measures can they pull? If I was in government, God, that will never happen. But if I was, again, I'd be making the same reviews if it was a household budget. You don't like doing this, but the only real tangible option that's going to have the biggest influence is asset sales.
Yep.
So if it was a household budget, you'd be thinking about, well, we do really like this house, but the biggest expense in a household budget is that mortgage repayment. We've got to get a smaller mortgage. So that means, living in either a different town or a smaller house. It's generally not received very popular with an electorate to say we're going to sell some assets, but they need to raise tens and tens of billions of dollars. You can't just say, let's raise that by increasing taxes, because that's actually made the problem worse.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we've done population. We know that it is not a driver of house prices. And you did mention before that the local economy is one of the biggest drivers of the local property performance. And because you're a guy who stands in front of a map with pins on it, and you're a guy that I can throw pretty much any city in Australia at you and you'll have something to say, I'm not going to... This isn't a gotcha moment. I'm going to give you one that I know that you're across, which is probably a really great example of the local economy benefiting from decisive moves, infrastructure investment, all sorts of investment that we've seen translate into great growth in 2024 and quite a lot of predicted growth even by yourself in 2025, and that's Townsville. So how would you contrast what you kind of see in Townsville that can maybe help to educate us about, okay, if this sort of stuff happens in other townships, this is a precursor to property performance?
Yeah, great question. Townsville is probably a good case study to help people understand the importance of economic growth. Perhaps before I talk specific to Townsville, Mike, if we can pull back up the graphic, one of the ones we had earlier titled Golden Era, Part 1 of 2. Because there was some, so we got that there. So if our audience can focus on the bottom right-hand corner, where we've got the graphic of jobs created, for consistency, on the left-hand side of that graphic, we got those three columns represent the total change in job volumes for the 5-year period directly before COVID. So you can see the yellow column, that's great growth of Sydney and Melbourne's jobs. Sydney and Melbourne's property market performed quite well in that period of time. The light orange is the other capital cities bundled up, and the red or dark orange is the regions. Now have a look and compare each of those columns in the most recent 5-year period, so on the very far right-hand side, to the previous 5 years. You can see that, so we're still talking 5-year blocks, but the number of jobs created in Sydney and Melbourne, the yellow column on the right is lower than the yellow column on the left.
Yep.
Have a look at the change in the other two columns. The number of jobs created in the other 6 capital cities combined, that orange column is much higher in the last 5 years than the previous 5 years. Have a look at the number of jobs created in the last 5 years in regional Australia, which is misleading because there's so many bloody regions, but we've bundled them all up into one big basket, and that column is higher than the previous period. It's no coincidence, it never is. It's always a story about economic growth. Economic growth, it gives households confidence. Economic growth makes jobs more stable. Economic jobs, in a lot of cases, increases household income. When you combine those ingredients, more people transact in real estate. By the end of this presentation, hopefully people will understand how economic performance is 1,000,000 times more important than population growth. Population growth doesn't buy property. 95% of properties bought every single year are purchased by the existing resident population. There will be some people listening to this, Mike and Simon are part of this, who have bought properties more than once in their life. But when we've bought property, we haven't influenced the population figures in those years. What we have done, though, is when you buy a property, you're becoming one extra party that's competing with someone else. Whether it's property, whether it's food, whether it's fashion, whether it's jewelry, the more people you have who want to purchase something, that's called competition. Competition is what influences the price of things.
I remember you explaining this to me. I think it might have been over a bottle of red. The difference between property demand and population. And you sort of said to me, how many times have you bought a property? And I said, oh, well, a few times. And you said, how many times have you been born? And I thought, well, that's a pretty stupid question. But then a light bulb moment went off, and then that I think helped me through that understanding.
Yes. Maybe we can pull up another graphic. Oh, I haven't forgotten your question about Townsville, Mike. It's a great case study. But if we pull up another graphic that's got property transactions, what we've got here, again, the same period of time. The green columns represent the total number of properties that were sold in Australia in each month. All right. So, and for consistency, I've drawn a vertical orange line through the middle of the graphic to separate the two periods we're talking about here. Pre-COVID, on the left-hand side of this graphic, those green columns in just about every month are lower than just about every month of the green columns in the post-COVID era. Can we see that?
Yeah.
We can also recall some of the earlier graphics where population declined in those first 2 years.
Yeah, and I can
when the border
be
was
able
closed.
Here we go. Population is that one. You can see it there on the top right.
Yeah. So you can see those two tiny little columns in the top right-hand side there, 2020 and 2021. So population, Australia as a whole, increased a little bit in those 2 years because, of course, even though population wasn't growing from overseas migrants, babies were still being born. That's the only contribution to population growth. People were still dying, though, but there were more babies born than people dying. Babies don't buy property. Hopefully people know that, right? There is no demand for housing from a baby being born. Right, so now that we've got it crystal clear, 2 calendar years, effectively population declining with the exception of babies. You are now looking at a graphic that shows green columns that are roughly twice as high, in some cases 3 times as high as what they were in the 5 years directly prior to COVID. These are the number of properties that transacted. It's got nothing to do with population growth, people. Why do people buy property? Think about your own circumstances and how your own life has changed at different periods and will continue to change. There are 5 common buyer types. There's the first home buyer, typically someone in their late 20s, early 30s. There is the person who's typically in their late 30s, early 40s, wanting to buy a bigger home because the one that they first bought is no longer big enough, so they've got a couple of kids now. The third buyer is upgrading to something nicer. It might not necessarily be bigger than the second home that they bought, but it is something nicer, closer to the dream home, stereotypically, that it might be purchased by someone in their late 40s. The fourth type of buyer is the property investor. The fifth and final type of buyer is the person who's moving town, either moving completely from a different country to somewhere in Australia, known as an overseas migrant, or moving from, say, Melbourne to Geelong or wherever, known as an internal migrant. They are the 5 reasons that people buy property. Of those 5 reasons, only one of those influences population figures. The last one. Every single year, about 95% of properties that are purchased have nothing at all to do with population growth. It's the existing resident population. There will be more people transacting in real estate, whether it's as a first home buyer, whether it's to buy something bigger, whether it's to buy something nicer, whether it's to invest. There'll be more people doing that if they have confidence in their job. There'll be less people doing that if they don't have confidence in their job. Why is that? Because we've got to pay that bloody mortgage back. That's why. So the green columns show a huge increase in buyer activity. And it's only partly related to internal migration. A lot of these transactions were someone saying, oh, geez, I'm spending more time at home now, and I want to live a bit differently to how I was before. Let's get something bigger. Let's get something nicer. I've circled there that gold oval. That's the period from about the middle of 2020, which is actually when the boom started. Just 3 months after the international border closed, and all of those lemon suckers said that house prices would decline by between 30 and 50%. Just 3 months after that, the boom started. The blue line is showing the number of properties for sale. That's the most important metric for supply. When the people put on pedestals described as experts talk about supply, all they do is every time they open their bloody gob and their lips move, they just highlight they know nothing. They think that supply is construction.
That's all it is, isn't it? It's like, how many homes are we building? That is what supply is.
Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's not important that Australia builds, a minimum of X new homes each year. But if you want to understand property market performance, it's got stuff all to do with new construction. Now and 100 years ago, Australia has never, ever had problems building stuff. Right? We're known globally for more than a century of being really good at building stuff. The problem is never to do with our ability to build. Property market performance is strong when you've got high confidence, that's demand, we've just been talking about that, and when that's combined with a lower than normal number of properties on the market to buy, you get pressure. So to have a look at the blue line here, and let's far left, right? Focus there and then follow it across. The 5-year period directly leading into COVID, when the border closed, that orange dotted line there, the number of properties listed in Australia was progressively shrinking. When I looked down the TV camera in early March when the border closed in 2020 and said there's going to be this big boom, that was strongly on my mind. I already knew that population growth really doesn't have anything much to do with property markets. I didn't care about the border being closed. But what I did know is housing never, ever goes out of fashion. It's not a fashionable item. It's shelter, and we always need it. And at the time of the border closing, we had already reached a record low number of properties on the market. You can't buy something if it's not in the market. It's got nothing to do with what the construction sector is doing. Is it for sale? Mike and Simon can't buy something if it's not for sale, whether it's new or established. And 95% of properties purchased every single year are established, not new. So I'm looking at it when the border closed, saying we've already got record low number of supply. I know as a keen student of history, every moment of adversity in the history of humans is responded to with money. So there's going to be more buyers when you throw money at an economy, and we already have a record low number of properties on the market. I also rationalise that it's probably likely that the number of properties on the market at the start of COVID would probably shrink, because some people will frink. They will listen to the lemon suckers and go, oh, not a good time to sell my property. They'll take it off the market, which actually creates more pressure. What did the blue line do? First couple of years of COVID, sharp decline. All right.
Yep.
Seagulls did fight over that ship. And the oval there highlighted in gold shows the enormous boom, that spectacular, like 20%, 30% growth in individual calendar years, up to and including May 2022. The red text here, that's when the RBA started to increase interest rates because of the global recession we were talking about. But again, we were told be fearful of the mortgage cliff. So let's finish off this graphic. And what's it telling us? We were told that no one's going to be able to afford their mortgage, and there's going to be all these everyone's going to be putting their house up for sale on the market. So what did the blue line do? It increased a little bit, didn't it?
Yep.
But it's still roughly half the volume of what it was before COVID. Look at the height of that blue wavy line in the 5 years before COVID, and look at the height of the blue wavy line in the, turned out to be about 18-month period of the RBA increase cycle. Heck of a lot lower. Where's all the for sales? Not there. They were never going to do that because Australians were already flush with cash, strong incomes, good equity in their homes. Buyer activity, the green columns, in this period of the RBA interest rate increases is still higher. Those green columns are higher than the pre-COVID period, despite rising interest rates. What has property markets done across Australia in the last couple of years? Some have lost a bit of value. Some have gone sideways. Last calendar year, there were still large parts of Australia that enjoyed double-digit growth with these record high interest rates that apparently no one was going to be able to afford. First home buyers were never going to be able to afford housing, apparently. There were more people who bought a home for the first time in the last 5 years than the 5 years before that, Mike.
I think you had a stat on that one as well. Yeah, there we are, the first home buyers.
You've got it there. Yeah. So the circle in the middle, the pie graph in the middle, first home buyers, the light orange, 467,000 people were first home buyers in the 5 years before COVID. An extra 45% bought a home for the first time during a period when the border was closed, population was declining, interest rates were going through the roof, and the price of housing was getting higher and higher and higher every single day. Which just highlights, people can whinge as much as they want, but if someone has a will, they will find a way.
While we're here, did you want to reference this 10 years of growth graphic as well? Because there's some really interesting insights there, and some of those will argue with this old adage about population growth being the driver of performance as well.
Yeah, and now it's you know, with 400 townships, it's physically impossible to put the property market performance of all on one graphic. But what I have done here is included the 8 capital cities and many of the bigger regions. But you know, apologies to the hundreds of other locations across Australia, many of which are bloody awesome, that aren't featured here. The two numbers next to each city show, the first number in orange shows the change in median house price for the 5 years directly before COVID, and the blue number shows the enormous growth in the 5 years post-COVID with weak population growth and rising interest rates. So you can see Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, you know, the 70% is close to 80%. You can see the locations like Dubbo grew by just as much as the best performed capital cities over the last 5 years. Why is that? Dubbo's got a bloody strong economy. Dubbo's economy is, believe it or not, Dubbo's economy has greater diversity than, I would argue, 6 out of 8 capital cities. And there's lots of Dubbos throughout Australia that some humans might stereotype and say, I wouldn't want to live there. But the reality is it's, you know, it's about our 45th largest city. And for about 30 years has had an unemployment rate well below the national average. And again, there are dozens of locations like Dubbo throughout Australia. Broken Hill is interesting. Broken Hill, over the entire last 5 years, its population declined. Sydney and Melbourne had 2 years where it declined and then had all that overseas migration. Broken Hill's population has declined every year for now about 70 years. A lot of people those who do understand a little bit about Australian history, there was a point in time 100 years ago, Mike, when Broken Hill was our 9th largest city.
Wow, fancy that.
Broken Hill was bigger than some of our capital cities this time 100 years ago. But from about 70 years onwards, up to and including now, the population has declined every single year. Another one of those fascinating facts to prove that property markets is not a measure of population growth. Broken Hill's, not only did the property market do well in the last 5 years, over the last 20 years, Broken Hill's median house price is now 3 times higher than what it was at the start of the period 20 years ago. And to put a reference point around that, Sydney and Melbourne, their property market has also tripled in value over the last 20 years. Clearly, their population has not declined over the last 20 years. Broken Hills has. There are so many things to disprove the population bullshit that people hang their hat on.
I think we've probably done it. I think anyone that's been on the Zoom today will be the beneficiary of that knowledge, and hopefully you'll be charged with all the knowledge you need to interject in these barbecue conversations that XYZ market's not going to perform because the population's in decline.
It's always about economic growth. So if anyone is interested in, the outlook for markets, whether it's for 2025 or 2045, the secret sauce is to take a keen interest in local economies, not the national economy. It largely doesn't matter what ScoMo says or Albanese says or whoever the future prime ministers are. Yes, their decisions will indirectly affect every part of Australia. But what is the most important thing are what are the levers being pulled on Townsville, on Melbourne, on Perth, on Busselton, on Orange, on Bendigo, Ballarat. What are the local levers being pulled and how are those likely to influence their economy in future years?
Well, on New Year's... Sorry, Simon?
You go, mate.
On New Year's Eve, you did actually publish your predictions for 2025. And of course, we've gone through enough evidence to show why you're somebody worth listening to, especially at times where the consensus is going in the other direction. So I want to give everyone an opportunity to put their questions in the chat to Simon if you have some questions for Simon. But let's have a look at that report that you produced on New Year's Eve for 2025. And I mean, you could even segue into Townsville because that is an area that you highlighted should have some good growth. But talk us through some of the big ones and perhaps even some of the surprising locations.
Yeah, I didn't answer your question about Townsville, so my apologies.
Right. I'm keeping you honest.
So every single year there's the usual economists, the lemon suckers, who do their property market outlook report for the year ahead. And mark my words, go back and check the internet what they've said every single year. They've got no imagination, no positivity at all. Every city, according to them, is going to go somewhere between 2% and 6 or 7%. That's what they say every single year. We sort of thought, well, we always produce an annual market outlook report as well, but I get sick to death of only hearing about the 8 capital cities when we got bloody 400, and the best ones are always among the 400. So this year we did something completely different and did a market outlook for Australia's 25 largest cities, which, why 25? The 25th largest in Australia has a population of 100,000 people. So we pick it and everything that's bigger than that. So Albury-Wodonga, the border town city of New South Wales and Victoria, is our 25th largest city. Of those 25 cities, we forecast growth of some kind in 20 out of 25. In some cases, growth might be 1 or 2%. In a case like Townsville, it is highly likely to be, somewhere between 25 and 30%, believe it or not. Why? Because the economy is the strongest we've seen of any city for probably 20 years, now and for the foreseeable future. The 5 that we anticipate declines are by no means crashes. People who own properties in these 5 cities, you have nothing to be fearful about, but they are Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, Geelong and Ballarat. 5 out of the 25 largest cities will have some decline this year, largely due to softness in their local economies and higher than normal number of properties for sale. I must emphasise though, 25, whilst it's a much bigger number of cities to do an annual market outlook on, we have 400 townships. So by no means should you just be focusing on the 25 in our report. I can promise you, Propertyology is buying properties in lots of locations that aren't among those 25. You want to hear more about Townsville, Mike, or you want to ask me some other questions about other parts
Yeah,
of
look,
Australia?
well, I want to ask you about Townsville, and I want to circle back on Victoria shortly. But
Okay.
yeah, the original question with Townsville is, and you've just referenced it's a moment ago, the local economy is in better shape than you've seen. And what is it about what's happening there that can inform us as investors to say, okay, well, I can see some of that stuff happening in this particular location, so it's worthy of my eyeballs?
Yeah, okay. So Townsville, for those, I'm sure everyone's heard of it. You know, some people have been there. Some people know very little about it. But it's our 14th largest city, population a bit more than 200,000 people. So it's not that much smaller than Hobart. It's bigger than Darwin. It's a similar population size to Geelong and Wollongong and Newcastle. It's a big city of substance. If you drew an imaginary line through a horizontal line through the middle of Australia, on the east coast you'd be somewhere around Brisbane. On the west coast you'd be somewhere around Geraldton. Townsville is the largest city in all of Australia above that horizontal line, and its proximity to Asia is a strategic benefit to it as well. It's always had a diverse economy. It is our national military capital because we are a country in the southern hemisphere. If we were ever to be attacked, it would be from the north. So it makes a lot of common sense in the national security interest to put our military arsenal up the top, not down the bottom. Townsville's got a large percentage of its workforce in defence, but it's not overly reliant on it. It's got a lot of other government departments that are up there as well. But the economic diversity, it is as diverse as Sydney and Melbourne. It's not a mining town, but inland from Townsville and in sort of central Queensland, whether it's coal or particularly in the case of Mount Isa, all that shiny stuff that if you ripped your laptop or your iPhone apart and all those little shiny bits of metal in there, a lot of that comes from a place called Mount Isa. Mount Isa is a mining town, but all those valuable, gold and zinc and lead and nickel, etc., most of it comes on the train line in through Townsville. Some of it goes out of the port of Townsville to different parts of the world. Some of it ends up in a factory and is refined to become copper wiring or piping or something like that. So natural resources is a small element of the economy. It does feed into manufacturing. There's a lot of very, very large renewable energy projects happening inland from Townsville, and Townsville will provide the goods and services for a lot of the very, very valuable infrastructure projects. Northern Australia is a big food bowl, whether it's the bananas that we buy at the local supermarket, the beef, the sugarcane, lots of other fruit and vegetables are grown up there as well. Townsville's not a farming town, but again, it's the big capital city that services those communities. A lot of benefit happened in Townsville. Unfortunately for them, the year directly before COVID was when they completed construction of a world-class sporting stadium. Why I say unfortunate, because it took about 4 years to build that big thing. And just as it was finished and they were about to launch into hosting all these events, the world closed up and we had to, we couldn't have mass gatherings anymore. So timing wasn't great. But as it opened up, it started to benefit from that. And that has had a big impact on the local economy. So when you've got a big stadium that has an annual calendar for whether it's NRL, whether it's international rugby or hockey or whatever, it'll participate in the Olympic Games. But Pink, the singer, and all sorts of the Killers were up there the other month. So this is the thing, when you invest in real big stuff like that, infrastructure like that, you create so much energy in the community. You give them something to connect, strong community values. You benefit the visitor economy. So there's new hotels, there's new restaurants, there's an expanding casino. Like this is all largely on the back of building a stadium. Mm. So the visitor economy is just going nuts. Now, Townsville's never been renowned for being a popular holiday destination. Not that it's a bad place at all to go to, but it's a lot different if you went there now compared to, say, 10 years ago. And it's just the very, very start of some really exciting things to come.
So before we get some insights into some of the areas that you're expecting to grow really well, I want to go back to Victoria just quickly.
Okay.
You talked about Geelong, talked about Ballarat, you talked about Melbourne, all as locations you don't see major growth coming from. But the sentiment around Victoria now is starting to really, really simmer. And I'm already hearing anecdotally that buyers agents on the ground are very, very busy. There's a very pervasive idea about mean reversion that
Oh God, do my head in.
it must pull that market back up. And I do wonder how much sentiment has an impact on the growth of a market outside of fundamentals, because the fundamentals aren't really there. But there's just so many people saying it's so cheap, it shouldn't be cheaper than the Perth median, the Brisbane median, the Adelaide median. It's got only one way to go, and that is up. Now, you're not someone that's worried about what other people say or sentiment, and you
Never.
say no. So I'm just interested in sort of contrasting those two ideas.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say, and I've said this frequently, this is not new. People who own a home in Melbourne or an investment property in Melbourne, you have no reason to be fearful of the value of your asset. We've never once said the Melbourne market or anywhere in Victoria is in for a market crash. We've never said that. Our commentary has always been comparing the outlook for Melbourne, as we do every single year, comparing the outlook to Melbourne of other parts of Australia, and explaining why we feel a certain way, positively or negatively. But it always comes back to the economic levers on the demand side of things and the volume of housing supply. I've got absolutely zero doubt that anyone who bought a property in Melbourne in the year 2025, fast forward 20 years from now, and history will repeat itself as it's done for the last 100 years, that property will probably be 3 times worth what you paid for it in 2025. So if you want to look at it like that, and you're justifying that as a reason to invest in Melbourne, no problems, right? I can say the same thing about Broken Hill, about Townsville, about Broome, about Timbuktu. It doesn't matter. So if you're looking to invest now and always, it's in every investor's interest to begin by objectively reviewing 100% of your options.
Yeah.
Big does not mean better. Big does not mean safer. Not many people, other than data nerds like me, would realise that Melbourne's median house price today, we've just been talking about, it's been the second worst out of 140 in the last 5 years. Only Alice Springs was worse. Over the last 7 years, Melbourne's median house price today has increased 3% in 7 years. So why is that relevant? It's got nothing to do with the future, but for the naive, simpleton statements that so many people continually make, saying that it's got something to do with the size of the city or comparing its current median house price to Perth or Timbuktu, is irrelevant. Future performance of anything, of a business, of a property market, of a sporting team, of a whatever, future performance is determined by future inputs. It doesn't matter what another city does or another business does. It's what do you do? And we've been talking earlier about why it's performed so poorly over the last 7 years. So if people want to make an honest assessment of Melbourne or anything, review the recent decisions that have been made, review the financial resources available, and what decisions are going to have an influence on the future. That's the way to objectively assess things. The fact that Melbourne's got a population of 5.5 million people, and the fact that whether it's property or anything else, humans have a confirmation bias. If you like Wagyu, you'll talk about Wagyu because you like Wagyu. If you live in Melbourne and you love living in Melbourne, you'll constantly talk positively about Melbourne. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to make an intelligent decision, an intelligent assessment, it also requires acknowledging personal biases and personal preferences. Take it from a very experienced, seasoned investor, confirmation bias is a recipe for major frustration. Back in the day before I realised the importance of being a borderless investor and not being hinged to my own hometown, I suffered from confirmation bias. And I justified to myself, we're talking 2010, I justified to myself why I should buy in Brisbane and should buy nowhere else. So what did I do? I bought in Brisbane. Deep down, I realised on reflection, I only bought in Brisbane because it's my hometown and I wanted it to do well.
Mm.
So I found ways to justify why it would be better than anything else.
And if you talk about sentiment, there was a period in time where the whole of the country was talking about Brisbane. Brisbane's going to boom. And as a Brisbane local, as a person who has a buyer's agency business that's really based in Brisbane, of course you buy nationally, but you've got the resources there. It would have been great for you to go, yeah, I agree. But when all that focus and attention came to Brisbane and it invariably led to you, you sort of said, no.
No. So doesn't matter the size of a city, capital city or region, 20,000 population, 20 million, does not matter. I mean, God, how many examples have we already given in this conversation today about what's done well and what hasn't done well? It's got nothing to do with capital city or region, Mike. So we spoke about lemon suckers and why people should never listen to, why there's going to be another crash. So I would say the same thing about never listen to someone who's got an obvious confirmation bias, whether the bias is about Brisbane or Melbourne or whatever. Unfortunately for them, they've got an inability to objectively assess things. Recognise that. Be on your guard about acting on those things. We've all got it. We've all got a confirmation bias. But do we actually have the skill to recognise that it's there and not allow it to influence the words that come out of our mouth and the things that we say and the decisions that we actually make? I want Melbourne to do well. I want everyone to do well. But my reputation is not built on saying what I want to happen. I believe in telling people what they need to hear, which isn't always what they want to hear. My home city of Brisbane had a 10-year period of time where the median house price only increased by 20% in 10 years, Mike. And that 10-year period only recently ended, 2019. If you bought an apartment in Brisbane 10 years before that, in 2009, that apartment was still worth the same value.
The same.
10 years later. If you bought a property in Perth in 2006, it was worth the same 14 years later. Brisbane and Perth, for those who don't know, are big cities, our third and fourth biggest city. Sydney has had a couple of periods in its history where the median house price has not moved for 6 or 7 years. Melbourne has had a period in the early 90s where the median house price, zero growth in 7 years. It's always a story about local economies, and it's got nothing to do with, are you the biggest or smallest city in Australia?
All right, Simon. Well, I think we're all convinced on that, and we're keen to hear a couple of locations before we close. And I'd love to sort of have you expand on why you've highlighted those in reference to the comments and education you've given us today. I want to give everyone a last chance to chuck a question in the chat as well. But when we look at that top 25, or even if there's an example that's outside of those top 25 most populous cities, what has got your attention for 2025?
Well, we spoke a lot about Townsville, but again, I think what's more important than me to say, I will give some names, but I don't think naming names of cities actually help people learn. That's just feeding people information, right?
Sure.
What I try to do every time I get the privilege of talking is to help teach, which is, what we've spoken about, the importance of the last 5 years. And you've seen, now that we know what happened in the last 5 years, and we spoke a lot about more than what happened, but why it happened and the importance of local economic conditions. 2025, you need to have a think about, well, where are the towns and cities that are likely to have a good economy? The best, in no particular order here, the best state economies are Queensland, Western Australia, and South Australia. They have been the best property markets in the last couple of years have been among those three states. And for the foreseeable future, those three states will continue to be the best performed state economies. That doesn't mean that the capital city will be the best performed property market just because they happen to be in those three states. Will those three capital cities continue to perform well? I believe so, yes. Until such time as economic decisions start to have an adverse influence on things. But there are lots and lots of regions outside the capital city in every single state. So in Queensland, I think Sunshine Coast will be one of the better performed property markets in all of Australia next year. I think the only location likely to rival Townsville, sort of 25 to 30% growth it will be in central Queensland, particularly Rockhampton. Not a location that I personally would invest in, though, because it doesn't have enough economic diversity, and that's very important to Propertyology's philosophy. But I think it will perform well this year. So Sunshine Coast will probably have around about 15%, which is a lot of growth on the back of it's already grown by about 80%. Gold Coast will still be strong, maybe around 10%. Brisbane around that sort of 7 to 10%, which is incredibly strong market. New South Wales is very mixed. I think Sydney will lose value this year. In saying that, though, these forecasts are all based on, I don't know any more than the people who sit on the board of the Reserve Bank what they're going to do with interest rates this year. So I've based our forecasts on no movement. Deep down, though, I tend to think that there will be some movement, and it could be as soon as 4 days' time, literally.
Yeah.
Right. But if that happens, that will have a positive influence on sentiment. Household budgets are fine. Look, the two most overused words in the English dictionary for the last decade have been crisis and expert. We heard the cost of living crisis every minute of every single day the last couple of years, but really 6% inflation. God, we've had predecessors had 3 entire decades where inflation was 10% each year. So, but yeah, I think interest rates will probably go down this year, and then, who knows? We might be pleasantly surprised, and they might drop by as much as 1% by Christmas. We shouldn't expect that to happen though. But if it does, the 5 or 6% decline that I'm anticipating Sydney might have this year might only be 1 or 2%. If that happened. There's nowhere in Victoria that will be a stellar performer because the state economy has such an influence on that. But that doesn't mean all of Victoria will lose value. Individual towns and cities where they're less reliant on white-collar jobs, they'll do well. So, and we mentioned some of those earlier, Mildura and Shepparton and Wodonga, still have solid growth this year. Western Australia is still a very, very strong economy, but anytime I talk about WA in any year, I always put the asterisks, subject to the actions of China. It's about $50 billion per year, Mike, that the Western Australia government get from clipping the tickets of iron ore. $50 billion bucks. That's a lot of money, right? So when commodity prices are strong, that state is a great place to be, but it works in reverse as well. So no one knows, when China will pull the rug on commodity prices. Hopefully it's a long, long, long time down the track. But if it's not, anything that we say about property markets in WA will quickly change. Tasmania, Hobart's likely to be very mild growth this year. It has flattened out in the last 2 years, but in the northern part of the state, they still had sort of 5 or 6% growth last year. Places like Launceston and Burnie, and they might get a bit more than that this year. Where have we covered? Are there any other questions you want to ask me about?
Well, I'm sure there might be some people in the chat that have got a certain location in mind. They'd like your 2 cents on it. So chuck that in before we close. But in the interest of following sort of your guidance before, that ideally you like to teach rather than just go, here's a hot spot, go your hardest. What was it, say, about, as an example, the Sunshine Coast market that you're observing that ticks that box of local economy is expanding, there's job opportunities, there's growth that you see as a huge driver to a property market? What can you see there?
To its credit, and this is not just Sunshine Coast here, but if we were having this conversation, let's say 15 years ago, around the GFC period, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Cairns were examples of great cities, great places to live, but similar in a way to Perth still now in regards to having some economic diversity, but not as much as a really resilient economy would ideally have. In Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast and Cairns, the over-reliance wasn't mining like everywhere in WA, it was tourism. But it doesn't matter what the industry is. If you've got a local economy that relies too heavily on one industry, without realising it, the performance of that property market, you're crossing your fingers that one industry doesn't have a significant period of sufferance. Because if it does, a higher than normal percentage of people will be adversely influenced in terms of their employment. But it's not just the individuals that are adversely influenced by their employment. It's the people in their immediate circle that sentiment rubs off onto as well. And they start questioning, well, Jill and Jack, they lost their job, and geez, I hope I'm not next. So you have fewer people buy property. So Sunshine Coast, to their credit, to Gold Coast credit, to Kansas credit, they learnt a lot from the GFC. They learnt the importance of diversifying their economy. Sunshine Coast will always be a very popular place for tourism. Yep. But it has become a Silicon Valley of Australia. They have put a lot of resources, a lot of energy into it being known, not just in Australia, but globally, as a knowledge place. So there's lots of tech-related businesses there, whether that's technology in general or whether it's related to health. There's a big infrastructure project, an internet cable, going through the ocean. So that the fastest internet literally in Australia now is in Maroochydore.
And just to give you a bit of anecdotal evidence to support that, the Vice President of the Australian PropTech Association, who's also the head of a PropTech accelerator business that's funded by the American Association of Realtors, which is a big deal, he lives in the Sunshine Coast because it's a tech hub, because he's got that internet connectivity, and if he needs to commute, it's connected, right? So, I mean, that's a fair indication that they've invested in tech in that location if that guy wants to be there.
Yeah. We were talking earlier about Townsville, and I rattled this off the top of my head about a dozen different things that fall under that banner of economic development. Well, Sunshine Coast has got a long list of those as well. I've just touched on a few, but that's when I talk about the importance of local economies and its direct link to property markets. That's what I'm talking about. It's not about internal migration and population growth and overseas migration, all that sort of stuff. That's peripheral stuff. It's what decisions have been made in recent years, or what's on the boardroom table now. What are they talking about doing? Are these initiatives that are going to expand economies, or are we tightening our belt? Are we contracting? That's how to think about property markets. So yeah, Sunshine Coast. We digressed a bit, but a good plug there for Sunshine Coast. An exciting year this year and for the foreseeable future, despite the fact it's already had some really strong growth.
Beautiful. Well, Simon, I think that's probably a great opportunity to drop you off. We've gone a little bit over time, hopefully as a little bit of a thank you to those who put up with the tech issues that we had in the beginning. But thank you very much for joining, everyone. I'll make sure everyone that's registered for this event gets a copy post the event. But thank you very much, Simon, for sharing all of your wisdom today. We've certainly learned a lot. We've smashed some preconceived notions of what drives property and got to the truth. And we're looking forward to seeing what 2025 brings. And best of luck to everyone out there investing in your investing success.
Thanks for having me on, Mike. I've enjoyed the chat.
Thanks, mate. Talk soon.